The British National Security Advisor warned this week that a breakdown of communication between the West and Russia and China has created a higher risk of what he calls a rapid escalation to strategic conflict. His observations are quite timely. The news just came out last week that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and the second in line to succeed the U.S. President, will be leading a congressional delegation to Taiwan next month, a trip that has been viewed by China as a serious provocation. China has issued the sternest warning, and the U.S. military does not rule out an attack on Pelosi's plane. Ukraine has long been a political football between the U.S. and Russia before it became a killing field. Will Taiwan become the next Ukraine? What does this mean, and what can we do to stop it? Hi, I'm David Wu, a former Wall Street strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about major global change. Welcome to The Money Game, where I take on groupthink, propaganda, and conspiracy theories in my critical analysis of markets, economics, and politics. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and the bell button so that you will be notified when a new video comes out. It feels like it was only yesterday when the US and China were considered by experts to be mutually dependent. Then one day, the US woke up and decided that not only it was getting the bad end of the bargain, but that China was also getting too big for its boots. Some thought a change in the US administration will put things back to where they were. But they were wrong. These days, signs of disengagement between the two superpowers are everywhere, if you know where to look. China may be still the world's biggest exporter to the US, but its share of total US non-petroleum imports has collapsed and stands now at just 19%, near a 15-year low. China is still the second largest holder of US government bonds, but its holding is declining and fell below $1 trillion in May for the first time in more than 10 years. Alibaba, the well-known Chinese e-commerce company, whose charismatic chairman once captured the imagination of American investors, just announced that it will be moving its primary listing from New York to Hong Kong. As they say, it takes less time to destroy than to build. But disengagement does not even begin to describe how bad things have gotten between the two superpowers. Last month, during an operation in the East China Sea that has been called the largest ever demonstration of power by US forces against China, some US fighter planes went beyond a Tokyo proposed medium line separating Japan from China that caused Beijing to scramble its fighters in response. Meanwhile, the US is building a global alliance to counter China. Last month, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand were invited to the NATO summit in Madrid, the first time these Asian-Pacific countries took part in a NATO meeting. The US has already killed off China's dream to become the world leader in 5G communication equipment. The nascent Chinese semiconductor industry depends on lithographic machines for making chips for cars, phones, and computers. Now Washington is pressuring Netherlands to widen an existing ban on the export of these machines to China. All these developments, including Pelosi's planned trip to Taiwan, point to a depressing reality, namely that the US and China are already in a new Cold War. Which side will prevail in the end is unclear. What is clear, though, is that this new Cold War will last for a very long time. What is clear is that this Cold War will be expensive, not only for these two countries involved, but for everyone else. Not only is an arms race expensive, but disengagement is expensive as well. Disengagement may ultimately lead to having two of everything in the world. Two supply chains, two trading systems, two payment systems, two technological architectures. Two is more expensive than one, that much we know. And somebody, which means probably everybody, will have to pay for it directly or indirectly. But the cost of the Cold War could be nothing compared to that of a hot war. The US and Russia were in an unofficial Cold War for more than a decade until the war in Ukraine broke out. The war in Ukraine has unleashed a food crisis in Africa, an energy crisis in Europe, and has pushed the world economy to the verge of a recession. What could provide a catalyst for a hot war, if only a proxy war, breaking out between the US and China? The answer is pretty simple: Taiwan. Taiwan and Ukraine have one important thing in common. They both suffer from an identity crisis. In Ukraine, the Russian-speaking minority who live in the east support closer ties with Russia, while the Ukrainian-speaking majority living in the west want closer ties with Europe. The Constitution of Ukraine, adopted in 1996 and based upon the Declaration of Independence of 1991, contained the basic principles of non-coalition and future neutrality. But in 2014 came a big change. The Ukrainian parliament voted to repeal a 2010 bill that had made Ukraine a non-aligned state, and only a few years later, in 2019, the Ukrainian parliament amended its constitution to explicitly set out a strategic goal for joining the European Union and NATO. This change in the status quo set the country on a war path with Russia. And what about Taiwan? In Taiwan, the population is divided between the nationalists who are in favor of unification with China one day, and those who want to sever the historic ties with China and declare independence. The Constitution of Taiwan, whose official name is still Republic of China, was ratified by the Constitutional National Assembly in Nanjing, the wartime capital in China, in 1946, and binds Taiwan to China. It is also the historical basis for the U.S. One China policy that acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China.
Our One China policy continues to be the policy we follow. We are guided, that One China policy, our One China policy, is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances.
The pro-independence activists in Taiwan want to change the constitution and permanently divorce Taiwan from China. In May this year, the U.S. State Department angered China by removing from its website on Taiwan the wording on not supporting Taiwan independence. It later reinstated the line following protests by China. But it is very clear that under the Biden administration, there has been a shift in U.S. policy towards Taiwan. The subtle shift is a new emphasis on self-determination. Just like Biden told Zelensky in December that only Ukraine will decide whether to apply to join NATO or not, Pelosi recently said that she supports the right of Taiwan to decide whether to seek independence from China.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide.
Just like the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO left Russia with no choice but to invade, China will undoubtedly resort to military action if Taiwan were to take the step of declaring independence. Not only has China specifically declared as much, but all Chinese experts agree on this point. Is Washington's support for the self-determination of Ukraine and Taiwan entirely altruistic? In other words, is the U.S. only motivated by a commitment to its liberal ideals? I'm intrigued by the fact that the shift of U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Taiwan is occurring at the same time that the U.S. has clearly fallen behind in the development of hypersonic missiles. Last October, the Financial Times reported that China had tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile that circled the globe before speeding towards its target. The test demonstrated an advanced space capability that put China well ahead of the U.S. Hypersonic missiles are slower than ballistic missiles, but they do not follow the fixed parabolic trajectory of ballistic missiles and are maneuverable, making them harder to track. Experts believe that a hypersonic glide vehicle armed with a nuclear warhead could help China negate U.S. missile defense systems. Meanwhile, Russia has also moved ahead of the U.S. in the deployment of hypersonic missiles. Last October, Russia successfully test-launched its hypersonic missiles from a submarine from a submerged position in the White Sea. The ability of China and Russia to launch hypersonic missiles from stealth submarines that are difficult to detect has altered the balance of military power in their favor. Even Biden publicly admitted that the U.S. is concerned. Is it possible that the U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Taiwan is influenced or even guided by this concern? Because the most obvious way for the U.S. to neutralize the advantage that hypersonic missiles are giving to China and Russia is by deploying intermediate-range ballistic missiles against them. And where would that deployment be? Obviously, as close as possible to China and Russia. Let us remember that the distance from the Russian-Ukraine border to Moscow is only 450 kilometers. Taiwan is only 800 kilometers from Shanghai, China's largest city, and 800 kilometers from Guangzhou, China's third largest city. A Ukraine as member of NATO and an independent Taiwan would allow the U.S. to deploy these missiles in these countries against China and Russia. Will the U.S. be able to turn Taiwan into the next Ukraine? Recent opinion polls showed that the support for independence in Taiwan has declined since 2020, with just under a third of the population saying that they support independence. A large majority of Taiwanese think that Taiwan already enjoys de facto independence and are thus not in favor of giving China an excuse to invade. What has happened to Ukraine is also giving any independence-minded Taiwanese pause. Ukraine is slowly being destroyed, with thousands killed and millions displaced. The US does not want to put troops in Ukraine, but is seemingly determined to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. The Taiwanese do not want to follow in Ukraine's footsteps. As much as Taiwanese are wary of Chinese retaliation against the Pelosi visit, they do not unfortunately have much of a say on whether she will go or not. So will Pelosi go to Taiwan as planned? She might find it difficult to back down at this point. U.S. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said this week that Pelosi will hand China a victory if she backs out now. Will Pelosi call in sick the last minute? Will she make a secret visit like her trip to Kiev in May? I don't know. All I know is that U.S. foreign policy under Biden has become reckless, especially with the midterm elections only 3 months away. All I know is that financial markets are still in denial of the short and medium-term consequences of the new Cold War. If you got something out of this program, I would appreciate if you would hit like and subscribe to my free YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about my investment strategy, come visit us at davidwunbound.com. Thank you for listening.